The alarm on my console screamed before I even had my coffee in hand. I am Nathan Brooks, Junior Liaison Officer for the newly formed Sol Outreach Office, and on that morning, 3 months after humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council, I learned that the universe does not wait for anyone to finish waking up. The message came from Counselor Vex Thrall, a tall, silver-skinned delegate from the Oran Compact, and his tone was not kind. He informed me, without any greeting, that a raider fleet had been spotted entering the outer edge of our solar system. He said it as if reading a weather report. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Earth should consider accepting the Council's protection agreement before it was too late. I remember standing there, staring at the star map on the wall of our small embassy pod, watching a cluster of red dots creep toward the orbit of Jupiter. My hands were shaking. I had grown up hearing stories about the stars, dreaming of what it would be like to meet other civilizations. I never imagined my first real taste of alien contact would come wrapped in condescension and delivered like a threat. 3 months earlier, when the first alien ships had entered our system, humanity had been offered a seat at the galactic table, but only as a guest, not as an equal. The Council called us a young species, fragile and unprepared. They looked at our fleet of aging space stations, our modest orbital labs, and our slow, careful diplomatic replies, and they decided we were exactly what we appeared to be: helpless. I did not fully understand, at the time, how wrong that assumption was. The Council had a name for planets like Earth. They called us Tier 4 worlds, meaning we had barely stepped beyond our own solar system, had no significant fleet presence, and posed no threat to anyone. Tier 4 worlds were often given a choice: pay tribute to a stronger empire for protection, or risk being picked apart by smaller raiding bands who preyed on the weak. It was, in their eyes, a mercy, a way of explaining the food chain before we got eaten by it. I sat through the first summit meeting between our ambassador, a calm and quietly sharp woman named Grace Whitfield, and the Council representatives. I still remember the way the Oran delegate leaned back in his chair, arms folded, while a Farron trade officer beside him kept glancing at his companion with something close to pity. They spoke slowly to us, the way one might speak to a child, explaining terms like protection tax and territorial guarantee as though we could not possibly grasp anything more complex. Ambassador Whitfield listened to all of it without interrupting. She thanked them for their concern. She asked thoughtful questions about how their alliance system worked, about past conflicts, about what protection actually meant in practice. And then, very calmly, she told them Earth would need time to consider their offer. The Oran delegate seemed almost amused by this. He told her, gently, that time was a luxury Earth did not have. Raiders had already begun scouting fringe systems near ours. He said it as a friendly warning, but I caught the undertone. It was less a warning and more an inevitability they expected us to accept. What none of them seemed to notice, in those early weeks, was how strange some of our answers were. When they asked about our defense capabilities, our officials gave vague, technical non-answers. When they requested details about our shipyards, they were told those facilities were under maintenance. When their scanners picked up unusual readings near our asteroid belt, our officials explained them away as mining operations, nothing more. I was young enough, and knew enough, to find all of this deeply unsettling. I did not know, back then, whether our leadership was simply overwhelmed and disorganized, or whether something else was happening beneath the surface. I asked Ambassador Whitfield about it once, quietly, in the hallway after a summit session. She only smiled at me, a small private smile, and told me to trust the process. I did not find that especially comforting. It was during the 3rd week of negotiations that I began to notice the little things. A supposedly decommissioned satellite near Mars that occasionally adjusted its own orbit, ever so slightly, in ways that decommissioned satellites should not do. A civilian cargo hauler that took an unusually long route between 2 stations, passing directly through a stretch of open space with no cargo destination nearby. Radio silence from 3 separate research outposts that were supposedly conducting routine experiments. I brought these observations to my supervisor, a retired naval officer named Colonel Marcus Doyle, who now worked as our internal security liaison. He listened to me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between amusement and caution. He told me that Earth had spent the better part of 2 centuries preparing for a day it hoped would never come. He said no more than that, and I did not push him further, sensing there were things I was not yet meant to understand. The Council, meanwhile, continued to press their case. They shared reports, translated through our newly built communication systems, describing raider groups that had struck other Tier 4 worlds in the past. The stories were troubling: entire colonies stripped of resources, populations displaced, infrastructure left in ruins. It was clear the Council wanted us to understand exactly what waited for civilizations who refused protection. I began to wonder if we were making a terrible mistake by hesitating. Then came the morning of the alarm, the message from Counselor Vex Thrall, and the sight of those red dots drifting steadily toward the edge of our system. I hurried to the embassy's central operations room, where a dozen officials were already gathered around the main display. Ambassador Whitfield stood near the front, arms crossed, watching the incoming fleet's projected path with an expression of calm focus that seemed entirely out of place given the circumstances. I expected panic. I expected frantic calls to the Council for emergency assistance. Instead, I found something closer to quiet preparation. Admiral Henry Sloane, a broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, entered the room moments after I did. He asked for a status report in a tone so level it almost startled me. An officer at the console read off numbers, coordinates, estimated raider fleet size. 23 vessels, mid-sized, moderately armed, moving in a loose attack formation typical of opportunistic raiders looking for an easy target. Sloane nodded once, said a single word I did not understand at the time, and left the room. I turned to Ambassador Whitfield, unable to hold back the question building in my chest. I asked her if we were going to request help from the Council. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something flicker behind her calm expression. Not fear, something closer to quiet resolve. She told me that we would handle it ourselves. I did not understand how that was possible. Our fleet, as far as the Council knew, and as far as I knew, consisted of a handful of unarmed research vessels and outdated patrol craft left over from decades of budget cuts and international disarmament treaties. 23 raider ships, even modest ones, could easily overwhelm anything we had. Counselor Vex Thrall contacted us again within the hour, his tone edged now with something that sounded almost like satisfaction. He informed us that the Council's peacekeeping fleet could intervene, for a modest advance fee, if Earth agreed in principle to the protection terms. He said the raiders would reach our outer colonies within 6 hours if nothing was done. Ambassador Whitfield thanked him for the offer, and told him Earth would manage the situation independently. I watched his expression shift on the display screen, surprise flickering across his silver features before he composed himself. He warned her, almost gently, that pride was a poor substitute for protection. She only replied that we appreciated his concern, and ended the call. I stood there afterward, staring at the star map, watching the red dots continue their slow crawl toward us, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I did not know what Earth was planning. I did not know if the calm confidence I saw around me was genuine strength or simple denial. All I knew was that in 6 hours, we would find out exactly what humanity truly was. Helpless, as the galaxy believed. Or something the galaxy had never bothered to understand. I spent those 6 hours pacing the embassy corridors, checking updates every few minutes, watching officials move with a strange, quiet efficiency that felt entirely unlike the panic I expected. Colonel Doyle passed me once in the hallway, and when I asked him if we were truly prepared, he only said that Earth had never stopped preparing, not for a single day since the world first looked up and wondered what might be looking back. As the 6th hour approached, every screen in the embassy switched to a live feed from our outer system sensors. The raider fleet had entered visual range of what our official records listed as an abandoned mining platform near the edge of the asteroid belt, a modest, unremarkable structure that had shown no activity for years. I held my breath, along with everyone else in that room, and watched as the raiders began their approach, utterly unaware that the quiet, sleeping void around them was about to answer back in a way no one, least of all them, could have ever expected. The raider fleet moved with the lazy confidence of hunters who had never once been challenged. I watched their formation drift across the display, 23 vessels spread in a loose net around the so-called abandoned mining platform, scanning it the way a predator studies a wounded animal before deciding it is safe to approach. I was seated beside Colonel Doyle in the embassy's secondary observation room, given access to the feed only because Ambassador Whitfield had insisted I see this for myself. She had told me, quietly, before the feed began, that some lessons could not be explained. They had to be witnessed. The raider commander, whose voice we intercepted through an open frequency, sounded almost bored as he ordered his lead vessels to begin their approach. He spoke in a rough dialect that our translation systems struggled to fully process, but the meaning came through clearly enough. He expected no resistance. He expected easy salvage, perhaps a few frightened miners to take as leverage, and nothing more. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The mining platform sat silent, dark, exactly as it appeared in every scan the raiders had taken. Their lead ships closed the distance, weapons ready but not yet armed, clearly anticipating a routine and uneventful approach. Then the platform opened. I do not know how else to describe what I saw. Panels that had appeared, for years, to be nothing more than weathered metal plating folded outward and away, revealing structure beneath structure, layer after layer of something far larger and far more solid than any mining platform had ever needed to be. What the raiders had approached was not a platform at all. It was a shell, a disguise, wrapped around something humanity had built and hidden in plain sight. The vessel that emerged from within was unlike anything the Council had ever recorded from Earth. It was not sleek, it was not elegant, it was heavy, layered, and built with the kind of overwhelming redundancy that comes from a species who has spent centuries preparing for the worst possible outcome and refusing to gamble on anything less than absolute certainty. Later I would learn its name, the Ironclad, first of what humanity called the Dreadnought class, though at the time, all I could think was that I was looking at something the galaxy had never imagined we were capable of building. The Raider commander's voice, still carried through the open frequency, shifted instantly from boredom to confusion. He ordered his ships to pull back, to reassess, but it was already far too late for caution to matter. The Ironclad did not rush. It did not need to. Its weapons activated with a slow, deliberate certainty, and within moments, the lead raider vessels found themselves unable to maneuver, their engines disabled by a coordinated strike so precise it left their hulls intact but their ships utterly powerless. I watched 3 raider vessels go dark within the first minute, drifting helplessly as their crews scrambled to restore power that would never return. The raider commander's tone shifted again, this time to something closer to alarm. He ordered a full retreat, but the Ironclad had already been joined by 2 more vessels of the same class, emerging from positions along the asteroid belt that our official reports had always listed as empty debris fields. I realized, watching this unfold, that Earth had never truly been undefended. We had simply chosen, for reasons I did not yet understand, to let the galaxy believe otherwise. Colonel Doyle, beside me, said nothing for a long moment. Then he told me that this was the first time in over a decade that humanity's true fleet had been allowed to reveal itself. He said the Council had never known, because Earth had never given them a reason to look closely enough to find out. I asked him why we had hidden this for so long. He told me that a species who reveals its full strength too early invites challenges it is not yet ready to answer. Better to be underestimated, he said, than to be measured too soon and found merely adequate. On the display, the raider fleet was falling into complete disarray. Their formation broke apart as ships attempted individual escape routes, only to find themselves intercepted, disabled, and left drifting in the cold silence of space. I did not see destruction in the way I had feared. I saw control, precision, a species demonstrating exactly how much restraint it was capable of exercising, even while delivering an overwhelming and undeniable message. I heard his voice one final time. No longer boastful, no longer bored, but tight with something that sounded almost like disbelief. He demanded to know what kind of world could hide something like this. No one answered him. The ironclad simply held its position, weapons still trained on his powerless vessel, as if waiting patiently for him to understand on his own. Within 2 hours, the entire raider fleet had been neutralized without a single vessel destroyed outright. Every ship had been disabled, stripped of maneuverability and weapons capability, left adrift for recovery teams to collect. I would learn later that this had been deliberate, a calculated choice by Admiral Sloan to ensure that no permanent harm came to the raider crews themselves, despite their intentions toward us. It was, I came to understand, both a mercy and a message. Earth could have ended them completely. Instead, it chose to simply stop them and let that restraint speak for itself. News of the encounter spread through the Galactic Council within hours. I watched, from my small station in the embassy, as diplomatic channels lit up with requests for explanation. Counselor Vex Thrall contacted us almost immediately, his earlier condescension entirely gone, replaced by a tone of careful, measured confusion. He asked, without any of his usual formality, how a Tier 4 world had managed to disable an entire raider fleet without assistance. Ambassador Whitfield's response was calm, almost gentle. She told him that Earth appreciated his concern for our safety, but that we had simply been managing our own affairs, as any capable world would. She did not gloat. She did not explain further. She simply let the silence afterward carry its own weight. I remember standing in the embassy that evening, watching recorded footage of the encounter loop across a dozen screens, and feeling something shift inside me. For weeks, I had absorbed the quiet condescension of the Council, the assumption that humanity was fragile, unprepared, a species to be pitied and protected. I had begun, without realizing it, to believe it myself. Watching the ironclad emerge from what the galaxy had dismissed as an abandoned mining platform, watching an entire raider fleet fall into helpless silence within 2 hours, I understood that Earth had never been the fragile world the Council imagined. We had simply allowed them to believe it, patiently, for reasons that were only now beginning to make sense to me. Colonel Doyle found me still watching the footage late into the night. He told me that this was only the beginning, that word of what happened would spread far beyond the immediate Council, and that other powers, larger and more dangerous than a raider fleet, would soon want to test the truth of what they had heard for themselves. He said Earth was ready for that too, had been ready for a very long time, and that I would understand exactly how ready very soon. I asked him how many more ships like the Ironclad existed, hidden away behind quiet disguises and abandoned facades scattered across our solar system. He only smiled, the same quiet, private smile Ambassador Whitfield so often wore, and told me that was a question the galaxy itself was about to ask, whether we were ready to answer it or not. As I finally left the observation room that night, I could not stop thinking about the Raider commander's final words, his voice tight with disbelief, as he asked what kind of world could hide something like this. I did not yet have a full answer for him, but I understood, for the first time since arriving at the embassy, that the galaxy's assumptions about Earth were about to be tested far more thoroughly than any of us had expected, and that humanity, quietly and patiently, had been preparing for exactly this moment for far longer than anyone outside our world had ever imagined. Within a day, every major channel in the Galactic Council was buzzing with the same question. How had a Tier 4 world, a species barely a few years into contact with the wider galaxy, managed to build and hide something as advanced as the Ironclad? I sat in the embassy's briefing room, watching Counselor Vex Thrall request an emergency session with Ambassador Whitfield, his tone stripped of every trace of the condescension he once wore so easily. The council chamber, when we finally connected through the secure channel, looked nothing like the relaxed, almost dismissive gathering I remembered from our first meetings. Delegates from a dozen different worlds crowded the display, their expressions ranging from open suspicion to poorly hidden alarm. I recognized a few faces from earlier sessions, though their postures had changed entirely. Where they once leaned back with folded arms, they now sat forward, attentive, careful. Vex Thrall opened the session by requesting a full explanation of what he called Earth's undisclosed military capacity. He reminded Ambassador Whitfield that full disclosure of defensive assets was a requirement for any world seeking recognition within the Council's protective framework. His tone suggested he expected an apology, or at least an admission of some kind of deception. Ambassador Whitfield did not apologize. She reminded him calmly that Earth had never requested membership within the Council's protective framework, nor had we agreed to any of the disclosure requirements attached to that framework. We had simply defended ourselves on our own territory against an unprovoked raid. She asked him whether any other independent world was required to disclose its full military capacity to outside parties as a condition of existing peacefully. The chamber fell silent for a long moment. I watched several delegates exchange uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for a response that questioned the very framework they had built their authority around. It was during this session that I was given permission, for the first time, to speak directly with a human military officer about the reasoning behind what humanity had built and why we had kept it hidden for so long. Captain Lucy Adler met me in a quiet side room of the embassy, away from the noise of the ongoing council session, and agreed to answer my questions as honestly as she could. Captain Adler had served for nearly 20 years within Earth's defense forces before being assigned to the diplomatic corps as a technical advisor. She had a calm, measured way of speaking, the kind that came from years of explaining complicated realities to people who had never lived through them. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I watched the ironclad emerge from what had appeared to be nothing more than an abandoned mining platform. I asked her how humanity had managed to build something so advanced while the rest of the galaxy remained entirely unaware. She told me the answer began long before humanity ever looked to the stars. She said Earth's history was defined by centuries of conflict between our own nations, wars that taught us, over and over, the cost of being unprepared. She described how, even after those conflicts ended, the lessons remained. Entire generations of engineers, strategists, and planners grew up studying worst-case scenarios, building contingency plans layered upon contingency plans, simply because human history had shown, again and again, that peace could shatter without warning. She explained that when Earth first developed the technology capable of reaching beyond our solar system, our leadership faced a choice. We could announce our achievements to the wider galaxy immediately, trusting entirely in the goodwill of civilizations we knew nothing about. Or we could take the time to understand exactly what waited for us out there before revealing everything we had. Given our history, she said, the choice was not difficult to make. I asked her how long humanity had known about the wider galactic community before official first contact was announced. She hesitated only briefly before answering. Nearly 40 years, she said. Long enough to observe patterns among the raiders and smaller powers operating near the edges of known space. Long enough to understand how quickly weaker worlds were absorbed, exploited, or destroyed by those who assumed control over them. Long enough to decide that Earth would never allow itself to become one of those worlds. During those 40 years, she explained, Earth had quietly built and expanded a defense network far beyond what any outside observer could have guessed from our modest, publicly known infrastructure. Shipyards were constructed deep beneath the surface of the moon and hidden within asteroid formations throughout our system. Entire generations of engineers worked on projects most of the public never knew existed, funded through channels carefully disguised as unrelated civilian programs. I asked her why the public itself had not been told. She said secrecy, however uncomfortable, had been necessary. A species cannot hide what it does not fully control, and controlling information at that scale required limiting who had access to it. She acknowledged this had not been an easy decision for our leadership to make, but she believed, given everything that followed, it had been the right one. I asked her about the Dreadnought class itself, the ships like the Ironclad that had so thoroughly dismantled the raider fleet without a single loss on our side. She explained that these vessels represented the culmination of everything Earth had learned from its own turbulent history. Where other civilizations, she said, often built their fleets around speed, elegance, and efficient use of resources, humanity built around redundancy, endurance, and the assumption that things would eventually go wrong no matter how well anyone planned. Every dreadnought carried multiple overlapping defense systems, she explained, so that no single point of failure could disable the entire vessel. Every weapon system had at least 2 backup methods of operation. Every critical section of the ship could be sealed off and isolated in the event of damage, allowing the vessel to continue functioning even after suffering significant harm. It was not a design built for grace. It was a design built to survive absolutely anything thrown against it. I asked her if this reflected something deeper about humanity itself, beyond simply military strategy. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. She said that Earth's history was full of moments where everything nearly fell apart, wars that nearly consumed entire continents, decades where global cooperation seemed impossible, and yet humanity always found a way to rebuild, to adapt, to continue forward despite everything working against it. The dreadnoughts, she said, were simply that same resilience given physical form. Our conversation was interrupted by an urgent message from Ambassador Whitfield, requesting both of us return to the main council session immediately. When we arrived, I found the atmosphere within the chamber had shifted once again, this time towards something closer to genuine unease. A new delegate had entered the discussion, representing a much larger power than the modest Oran compact that had dominated our earlier interactions. This new delegate, a broad-shouldered being introduced as General Threx of the Karsari Dominion, spoke with a tone that carried far more authority than anything we had encountered before. He informed the council, and by extension informed us, that the Karsari Dominion did not accept the idea of an unknown, undisclosed power operating within a region of space they considered strategically significant. General Threx stated plainly that the Karsari Dominion intended to send a small delegation fleet to Earth directly, framed officially as a diplomatic mission intended to verify the nature of our defenses and ensure they posed no threat to regional stability. His tone made clear this was not truly a request. It was a notification. Ambassador Whitfield thanked him for his transparency and told him Earth would welcome any delegation that approached with genuine diplomatic intentions. She added calmly that Earth expected the same courtesy shown to any sovereign world receiving visitors, and that any deviation from peaceful diplomatic conduct would be met with an appropriate and measured response. General Threx's expression, translated imperfectly through our systems, seemed to carry something close to amusement at her words. He ended the transmission without further comment, leaving the chamber in a heavy, uncertain silence. I turned to Captain Adler, unable to hide the concern building in my chest. I asked her if she believed the Karsari Dominion's intentions were genuinely diplomatic. She was quiet for a long moment. She told me that the Karsari Dominion was known throughout the region as one of the more aggressive expansionist powers, and that this so-called diplomatic mission was almost certainly a test disguised as a formality. I asked her if Earth was prepared for that test. She looked at me with the same calm, steady expression I had come to associate with everyone in humanity's defense and diplomatic corps, and told me that Earth had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment for longer than most people, myself included, could truly understand. As the council session ended, and the chamber's various delegates began disconnecting one by one, I found myself standing beside Ambassador Whitfield, watching the star map on the embassy wall where a new marker had already appeared, tracking the projected path of the Karsari delegation fleet toward our solar system. She told me quietly that the true test of everything humanity had built was only just beginning, and that the coming days would show the galaxy far more than any council session ever could. I did not yet know how right she was. The Karsari delegation fleet arrived at the edge of our solar system 4 days after General Threx's announcement, and from the very first moment their ships entered our sensor range, I understood that Captain Adler had been right to doubt their intentions. What had been described as a small diplomatic delegation turned out to be 11 heavily armed vessels, arranged not in the loose, casual formation of a peaceful envoy, but in the tight, coordinated pattern of a fleet prepared for confrontation. I stood once again in the embassy's operations room, watching the display as those 11 ships crossed into the outer edge of our system, their weapons systems active, their formation drawn tight around a central command vessel far larger than anything else in their fleet. Admiral Sloane studied the readings without any visible reaction, though I noticed his jaw tighten slightly as he confirmed the weapons signatures being broadcast from each incoming vessel. Ambassador Whitfield opened a direct channel to the Karsari fleet, her tone as calm and measured as it had been during every previous encounter. She reminded General Threx that his delegation had been described as a diplomatic mission, and she asked, politely but firmly, why his ships were approaching with active weapons systems rather than the peaceful posture typically expected of diplomatic vessels. General Threx's response came through with a faint edge of amusement beneath his otherwise formal tone. He explained that Karsari vessels always traveled with weapons active, regardless of mission type, as a matter of standard procedure. He assured her this was simply protocol and posed no threat, so long as Earth cooperated fully with the verification process his delegation intended to carry out. I did not believe him for a moment, and judging by the expression on Ambassador Whitfield's face, neither did she. Still, she thanked him for the clarification and informed him that Earth would allow his delegation to proceed toward a designated meeting point near the orbit of Mars, under the condition that his fleet maintain a respectful distance from our populated colonies and stations. General Threx agreed to these terms without hesitation, which Captain Adler later told me was itself a warning sign. A fleet with genuinely peaceful intentions, she explained, would have offered reassurances, would have attempted to ease tension rather than simply accepting restrictions without comment. His easy agreement suggested he expected the meeting point to serve his purposes, regardless of the terms attached to it. Over the following hours, I watched Earth's defense network shift into a posture I had never witnessed before. Vessels that had appeared, for years, as harmless civilian infrastructure scattered throughout our system began adjusting their positions with quiet, deliberate precision. I recognized some of them now, having learned to look past their disguises after witnessing the raider encounter weeks earlier. Cargo haulers that were not truly cargo haulers, research stations that conducted no research, satellites that served no scientific purpose whatsoever. Admiral Sloane explained, during a brief update to embassy staff, that Earth's full defense fleet was being quietly repositioned throughout the system, though he was careful to emphasize that no aggressive action would be taken unless the Karsari delegation demonstrated clear hostile intent. He reminded everyone present that Earth's goal remained peaceful resolution wherever possible, and that overwhelming strength was meant as deterrence, not provocation. I asked him, during that briefing, how many Dreadnought-class vessels Earth actually possessed. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and I sensed he was deciding how much to share. Eventually, he told me that number remained classified even within most of our own government, though he assured me it was more than sufficient to handle whatever the Karsari Dominion intended to bring against us. The Karsari fleet reached the designated meeting point near Mars 2 days later, and Ambassador Whitfield, along with a small diplomatic team, traveled to meet General Threx aboard his command vessel, following standard diplomatic protocol for direct in-person negotiations. I was not permitted to join her for this meeting, though I remained in constant contact through secure embassy channels, monitoring the exchange from a distance alongside Captain Adler and Colonel Doyle. The meeting began formally enough, with General Threx offering a lengthy introduction regarding the Karsari Dominion's history, its territorial holdings, and its role as one of the more established powers within this region of the galaxy. Ambassador Whitfield listened patiently, offering measured responses and thoughtful questions, much as she had during our very first summit with the Council months earlier. It was roughly an hour into the meeting when General Threx's tone shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. He informed Ambassador Whitfield that the Karsari Dominion had reviewed footage of the raider encounter near our asteroid belt and had concluded that Earth's demonstrated capabilities, while impressive for a Tier 4 world, likely represented the full extent of our military strength. He suggested, with a tone that barely masked his underlying intention, that Earth would benefit greatly from entering a formal alliance with the Karsari Dominion, one that would place our defense network under their direct oversight. Ambassador Whitfield declined the proposal politely but firmly, reminding him that Earth valued its independence and saw no reason to place its defense under the direct oversight of an outside power, regardless of that power's size or influence. It was at this point, according to the recording later shared with embassy staff, that General Threx's demeanor changed entirely. He informed Ambassador Whitfield that Earth's refusal left the Karsari Dominion with little choice but to establish a more direct form of oversight, one that did not require Earth's voluntary agreement. As he spoke, sensor readings from our monitoring stations detected a sudden shift throughout the Karsari fleet, weapons systems moving from standby to active status across all 11 vessels simultaneously. I remember the tense silence that filled our operations room as we watched this unfold from a distance, unable to intervene directly, trusting entirely in Ambassador Whitfield's judgment and the preparations Admiral Sloan had quietly put in place over the preceding days. Ambassador Whitfield's voice, when she responded, remained entirely calm, betraying none of the tension I imagined she must have felt in that moment. She informed General Threx that Earth had anticipated exactly this possibility, and that any hostile action taken against our diplomatic delegation or our territory would be met with an immediate and comprehensive response. General Threx laughed, a harsh, grating sound our translation systems rendered imperfectly, and told her that a single raider fleet meant nothing against the full might of the Karsari Dominion. He ordered his fleet to begin what he called a demonstration of true strength, intended, I later understood, to intimidate Earth into immediate compliance. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that left even Colonel Doyle, a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, momentarily speechless. Throughout our solar system, dozens of vessels that had spent years disguised as harmless civilian infrastructure revealed their true nature simultaneously. Cargo haulers unfolded into heavily armored escort vessels. Research stations split open to reveal weapons platforms capable of striking targets across vast distances. And from hidden shipyards buried deep beneath the surface of our moon, an entire fleet of Dreadnought-class vessels emerged into open space, more than I had ever imagined Earth possessed, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested years, perhaps decades, of careful planning and preparation. The Karsari fleet, caught entirely by surprise, found itself surrounded within moments, their 11 vessels, encircled by a force so overwhelming that even their attempted retaliatory strikes were rendered meaningless before they could properly begin. I watched, through the embassy's monitoring feed, as Earth's fleet systematically disabled each Karsari vessel one by one, targeting engines, weapons systems, and communication arrays with the same precise restraint humanity had shown during the earlier raider encounter. General Threx's command vessel was the last to fall silent, its weapons systems disabled, its engines rendered inoperable, left drifting helplessly within a ring of Dreadnought-class vessels that had appeared, quite literally, out of nowhere. I heard his voice one final time through the recording, no longer carrying the confident authority of earlier in the meeting, but instead something closer to stunned disbelief as he demanded to know how Earth had hidden a fleet of this magnitude from the wider galaxy for so long. Ambassador Whitfield's response, calm and measured as ever, informed him that Earth had never claimed to be without defenses. We had simply chosen, quite deliberately, not to advertise the full extent of what we were capable of, precisely because we understood how quickly demonstrated strength invited unwanted challenges. She informed him that his fleet would be released once full assurances were given that no further hostile action would be taken against Earth or its territory, and that any future diplomatic engagement between our worlds would proceed on the basis of mutual respect rather than assumed dominance. General Threx, given little choice in the matter, agreed to these terms. As the Karsari fleet began its slow, humiliated retreat from our system hours later, escorted at a respectful distance by a handful of Earth's Dreadnought-class vessels to ensure full compliance, I found myself standing beside Colonel Doyle in the embassy's operations room, watching the star map as the threat marker finally faded from our system's edge. He told me quietly that word of this encounter would spread through the galaxy far faster and far more thoroughly than the Raider incident ever had. The Karsari Dominion was not a minor regional power. It was one of the more significant forces within this part of the galaxy, and its humiliation at Earth's hands would force every other civilization who had once dismissed us as helpless to reconsider that assumption entirely. I asked him what came next, now that both a Raider fleet and a major regional power had learned firsthand the true extent of humanity's strength. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression carrying something between quiet satisfaction and cautious anticipation, and told me that the galaxy's true test of Earth was only just beginning, and that the coming days would determine, once and for all, exactly what kind of place humanity would hold among the stars. Word of the Karsari Dominion's humiliation spread through the galaxy exactly as Colonel Doyle predicted, faster and further than anyone at the embassy had anticipated. Within a week, requests for emergency sessions poured in from council members who had barely acknowledged Earth's existence during our earlier meetings. I found myself busier than I had ever been, coordinating communications between Ambassador Whitfield and delegates from worlds I had never even heard of before that point. The tone of these communications had changed entirely. Where once we received condescending offers of protection wrapped in thinly veiled threats, we now received careful, respectful requests for clarification regarding Earth's status within the wider galactic community. Counselor Vex Thrall, in particular, seemed almost eager to distance himself from his earlier assumptions about our world, requesting a private conversation with Ambassador Whitfield that I was permitted to observe from a respectful distance. During that conversation, Vex Thrall admitted, with what seemed like genuine discomfort, that the Council had fundamentally misjudged Earth's capabilities based on incomplete information and outdated assumptions about what a Tier 4 world could realistically achieve. He asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether Earth would consider revising the terms of our relationship with the Council, moving away from the protective framework we had never agreed to, and towards something closer to equal partnership. Ambassador Whitfield listened carefully, as she always did, before responding. She told him that Earth had never sought conflict with the Council or any of its member worlds. Our actions, both against the Raider fleet and later against the Karsari Dominion, had been purely defensive, taken only in response to direct threats against our territory and our people. She reminded him that Earth's goal had always been peaceful coexistence, not dominance or conquest. Vex Thrall asked, then, what Earth actually wanted from its relationship with the wider galactic community, now that the assumption of our helplessness had been so thoroughly disproven. It was a fair question, and one I realized I had been wondering myself throughout the preceding weeks. Ambassador Whitfield's answer was simple, and I have thought about it often in the time since. She told him that Earth wanted exactly what any sovereign world wanted: respect, the freedom to govern ourselves without outside interference, the ability to engage in trade, cooperation, and diplomacy on equal footing with other civilizations, rather than being treated as a lesser power requiring protection or oversight. And, perhaps most importantly, the assurance that our world would never again be mistaken for an easy target by those who assumed our quiet, careful diplomacy reflected weakness rather than restraint. Vex Thrall seemed genuinely moved by this response, promising to bring Earth's position before the full Council for formal consideration. Over the following weeks, I watched as the Council slowly began restructuring its relationship with humanity, moving away from the paternalistic framework that had defined our earliest interactions, and towards something that increasingly resembled genuine partnership between equals. Not every power within the galaxy accepted this shift gracefully. I learned, through updates from Colonel Doyle and Captain Adler, that several smaller raiding groups, having heard of both the failed attack on our system and the Karsari Dominion's humiliating defeat, chose to avoid our territory entirely, spreading warnings among themselves about the dangers of underestimating Earth. Other, larger powers approached us cautiously, seeking trade agreements and diplomatic ties rather than confrontation, having learned from the Karsari Dominion's mistake without needing to repeat it themselves. I asked Captain Adler, during one of our regular conversations, whether she believed Earth's approach to those 40 hidden years, all that quiet preparation and careful restraint, had truly been worth the secrecy and sacrifice it required. She considered the question thoughtfully before answering. She told me that humanity had spent centuries learning, often through painful experience, that peace maintained through weakness rarely lasted, while peace maintained through demonstrated strength, paired with genuine restraint, tended to hold far longer. Earth's dreadnoughts had not been built out of a desire for conflict. They had been built out of the memory of every moment in our history when unpreparedness had cost us dearly, and out of a determination to never again find ourselves at the mercy of forces we could not answer. She reminded me that in both encounters, against the raiders and against the Karsari Dominion, humanity had chosen restraint over destruction wherever possible. We disabled rather than destroyed. We demonstrated strength without seeking to cause unnecessary harm. This, she believed, was the true lesson Earth had to offer the wider galaxy, one that went beyond simply proving we were not helpless. It was a demonstration that true strength did not require cruelty, and that a species capable of overwhelming force could still choose mercy when given the opportunity. I found myself reflecting on this often during the following months, as Earth's position within the galactic community continued to shift and solidify. Ambassador Whitfield was invited to address the full council directly, an honor previously reserved only for established, recognized powers within the region. I was permitted to attend this session in person, standing quietly near the back of the chamber, as she delivered what I still consider one of the most important speeches I have ever witnessed. She spoke of Earth's history, our long and often difficult journey toward unity and cooperation among our own nations, a journey marked by conflict, hardship, and eventual understanding that our survival depended on working together rather than against one another. She explained that the same lessons which had once divided our world had ultimately taught us the value of preparation, resilience, and careful, measured strength. She spoke of the dreadnoughts not as symbols of aggression, but as reminders of everything humanity had endured and learned throughout its history. She told the assembled council that Earth did not seek to dominate the galaxy, nor did we wish to withdraw entirely into isolation. We sought instead a place among the stars built on mutual respect, fair cooperation, and the understanding that peace, when maintained through genuine strength rather than assumed weakness, tended to prove far more durable. The council chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, and I remember feeling, in that silence, a shift far greater than any single battle or negotiation could have achieved. It was the quiet, collective recognition among dozens of civilizations that Earth was no longer a world to be pitied, protected, or dismissed, but one to be respected, engaged with honestly, and treated as an equal partner among the many voices shaping the future of this region of the galaxy. In the months that followed, Earth formally established what became known as the Sol Federation, a recognized and respected member of the wider galactic community, engaging in trade agreements, scientific cooperation, and diplomatic relationships with dozens of worlds who had once considered us little more than a curiosity at best, or an easy target at worst. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, promoted to a more senior diplomatic role within our growing embassy network, tasked with helping negotiate agreements between Earth and the many new partners who now sought our cooperation and friendship. I often thought back to that first morning, the alarm sounding through the embassy, the sight of raider vessels drifting toward our outer colonies, and the quiet, calm confidence I had witnessed among Earth's leadership, even as I struggled to understand where that confidence came from. I understood now, far more completely than I had then, that humanity's strength had never truly been hidden out of deception or dishonesty. It had been held in careful reserve, patiently, deliberately, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. The raiders who once believed Earth an easy target learned in the end that they had been fortunate to survive the lesson at all. The Karsari Dominion, once one of the more feared powers within this region of space, found itself forced to reconsider its entire approach towards smaller, seemingly modest worlds, having learned firsthand the cost of underestimating a civilization built on quiet resilience and careful preparation. And the galaxy itself, which had once looked upon Earth with pity, condescension, and thinly veiled contempt, learned to look upon us instead with a wary, hard-earned respect, understanding at last that helplessness had never truly described humanity at all. It had simply been the mask we wore, patiently and deliberately, until the moment came when we no longer needed to wear it. I think of Ambassador Whitfield's words often, standing before that silent, stunned council chamber, reminding the wider galaxy that Earth sought not dominance, but partnership, not conquest, but respect. And I think, too, of the quiet strength behind those words, the generations of preparation, sacrifice, and careful restraint that made them possible. The galaxy thought Earth was helpless. In the end, it was that very assumption which taught every civilization who ever doubted us the truth of what humanity had always been, patient, resilient, and when finally called upon, utterly unstoppable in the quiet, measured way that only a species who remembers every hardship it has ever overcome can truly become.